Hey everybody, and Merry Christmas, and welcome to the Lambda Bible Studies. What a spectacular panel I have assembled tonight. Let's go down, starting with the world famous Settler's Lament. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here, but I do need to berate you guys on several things. First, by everyone being so late, you actually ruined my planned joke for today. I was planning on paraphrasing Gandalf here and saying that a famous YouTuber is never late. He arrives exactly when he intends to, because I was going to be like 5 minutes late, but then everyone else was late, so we delayed this like 40 minutes. So you ruined my joke entirely. I actually ended up being 35 minutes early. And I wasted my world famous time waiting here, chatting with Lambuda. It was very annoying. Also, Lambuda, I need to grill you on something. Why is it that you never have previews for your stream on your channel?
Previews?
Like on my channel, like if you click on my channel right now, it says like in 24 hours I'm going live. Like, why do you never have that?
Yeah, that's because it would be way too much work for me to do.
That's not a very good reason. I mean,
it would be useful though for the guests. It's a good point, because then they can go. I do that when I'm invited on other people's channels. You go and see when is this stream going to start, right?
Yeah, and then people are like, "Okay, cool. I'm free at that time. I'll view that."
Okay, well, noted. I'll put that. This is like the progress review for the last year of Lambda Bible Studies. Pharaoh, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Yes, not too bad, thank you. I'm quite tired. I've just come back from a long Christmas choir night at church, so but it was a big success. So
good. I'm glad to hear. Cringe Walker, we were just on a stream together.
I don't know who that is. I'm Advent Walker. That was Cringe Walker. There's a lot of people that have a similar voice to me, like that Luthemplar guy, and I'm Advent Walker. You were talking to Cringe Walker.
Sorry to mix you up. And last but not least, not only Radlib but also his wife. Welcome both of you to the stream.
Hi, you can call us, Radlib and Mrs. Radlib, or Stephen and Heather, whichever works.
Stephen and Heather. I'll go for that. That's more feels more personal. And you could call me Luke.
He's now public with his
out
name.
As a human.
New. This is new, and as of
I used to just be known as Lambda.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lambda or Luke.
Yeah. But yes, I'm most honored to have you. I'm honored to have all of my guests. So let's get going. This is the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Quite an epic beginning to a text. I wonder if that very opening gambit brings to mind any other bits of scripture for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, the obvious comparison is that it's the new Genesis. It's very clearly St. John here was trying to redo the creation account, making Christ the center of it. And in Genesis we read about God creating the world, and here we see that the Word of God was there when God the Father created the world. I almost feel like apologetics can sort of cheapen the Bible in a certain way. I like doing apologetics. I do apologetics a lot. So that's fine. But I quote John 1:1 all the time with non-Trinitarians or Muslims or stuff like that. Actually reading it, you get a completely different feel than when I'm just throwing it out at a Muslim or someone like that. And as I said, it's the obvious comparison is Genesis. Another, I think, important point here is that the word here, as I imagine most people know, is logos. It's not word because it's written in Greek, not English. And there's no real English translation for the word logos. Logos has a pretty wide semantic range in Greek. And generally translations are fine. And I'm not saying this translation is terrible. But logos, the idea of the divine logic of the universe, something very prevalent in Greek philosophy and in the Deuterocanon, which heretics reject, is something that St. John is invoking here.
Hey, I've had some streams on some deuterocanonical works recently. I thought you'd be pleased with that.
That is very based.
Just
Yeah.
can I just jump in there, just riffing off something that Settler was saying.
Please.
And for me, there is just something so beautiful about this passage, just in terms of the writing style. It's very unlike some of the Gospels in terms of it's got this kind of beautiful florid language to it. It's about the interplay of words. Obviously, the pun not intended there. So you've got the beginning was the word, you've got this word was with God, and the word was God. So there's the interconnection. It's all about these kind of very kind of beautiful terminologies. This interesting language to capture you, but there's that depth to it at the same time. So it's something that I think someone who has never read the Gospels before can look at that and say, okay, there's something interesting here. I understand light and darkness. There's this kind of basic level understanding, but woven inside there is this, Settlers mentioning logos and the kind of complicated philosophical background and the pregnancy that word has is secured into there at the same time.
So I find it odd in a way, right? The logos thing, it sounds more like a Paul kind of move, right? Reaching out to the Gentiles, which is not, well, I don't know. I don't seem to remember John having that as a theme throughout the gospel, really.
If we were thinking of what one of the Gospels written to the Gentiles, you'd be more likely to turn to Luke than John, I would think.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And so I just wonder, just trying to cast my mind through the Old Testament, I wonder what logos is connecting to from a Old Testament Hebrew type perspective. The only thing that comes to mind, and tell me if this is a stretch from the point of view of what logos is talking about, but when you talk about it being, sort of the logic of the universe, it makes me think of wisdom. Now, the problem with that is that there is the Greek word for wisdom, and that's not what's used here, right? But it feels like if I was going to connect logos, as I think it's intended in this passage, to any theme in the Old Testament, it would be wisdom as portrayed by Solomon and so forth, right? And there is a Christian tradition of Jesus being associated with wisdom, right? I mean, I think, isn't that the point of the Hagia Sophia, if I remember correctly, Pharaoh, that it's a tribute to Jesus as wisdom as a type of Christ, kind of. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm sure settlers know this better than I do, but in the Platonic understanding of the human, there are these kind of three different elements: the logos, the telos, and I can never remember the third one, representing the kind of intelligence, the kind of the chest or the heart of the man, and then the kind of the lower appetites at the same time. So again, from a philosophical perspective, it's got all of this idea of this almost like an intelligence or a wisdom, like you say. So yeah.
Okay, so it doesn't seem like too crazy of a stretch from your point of view, Pharaoh, to connect the logos in John 1 with, the wisdom, the image we have of wisdom in Solomon, say.
It's interesting because, again, it's a word with these multiple meanings, and like Seth says, you just can't translate it in the same way. So yeah, I think there is this thread of an intelligence, but there is also the idea of it as the word, and like the spoken word, isn't it, as well? And that's obviously important to the creation story.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, I understand what you mean, that like in a lot of ways John isn't like the primary element of the New Testament that's trying to reach out to Gentiles, and that's certainly true. Off the top of my head, I can't think of other parts of the book of John that are like that. There could be just ones I'm not thinking about. But with that said, I I know. I think it's hard to say other than the beginning of John. I think it's hard to sort of think of John 1, the whole chapter, or at least the first half that we're looking at, as something other than an attempt to retell the creation story for Gentiles. I and not exclusively, not exclusively for Gentiles, obviously. But yeah, that's basically what I'd have to say about that.
Yeah, so I just was doing a bit of research in the background, and in the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Hebrew texts into Greek, they use the word logos to translate the Hebrew word dabar, which means in Hebrew to speak, or so when we think of the speaking of God in Genesis, he speaks and light appears, and so I think that the fact that God uses words and then things happen, and when, for example, God appears in the burning bush, and then there's the voice of God, I think that's the speech that then becomes the word. So it's not word as written, but word as pronounced.
So quick connection to a passage that I never hear anyone talk about, and I've heard a gazillion sermons in my life, right? There is a moment where Jesus speaks words, and it has this tremendous power, and it's jumping into my mind as we talk about the logos and the spoken word, right? And God speaking the creation into existence. Remember, Moses says, "Who am I supposed to say sent me?" And God says, "I am who I am."
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think is the literally Yahweh. Is that right? Anyway.
It's a bit more longer than Yahweh. Yahweh is the usual translation, but the full pronunciation something like Eya Esra Ewa.
Right.
It's a fuller form of it.
Okay. Anyway, but yeah, God says, you're going to tell them I am who I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like it's sort of establishing himself as sort of an ultimate, right?
That's
sort of like the Alpha and Omega kind of thing. I am who I am. That's who I am. I'm it. Anyway, wait. Let me jump to this. So here's what it made me think of. I believe it's when Jesus is being arrested, and somebody says, "Are you, he who is Jesus of Nazareth," or something like that. He says, "I am," and I never hear anyone comment on this. The scriptures say they were like knocked back, as if he had like spoken like, this is like from D&D world or something.
That's so awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, he spoke with power, and it like knocked them to the ground. Yeah, they drew back and fell to the ground when he just said, "I am he," or I was associated it with "I am who I am."
Yeah.
He's like basically he's saying the name of God, and he is God saying it, and that is potent, right?
Anyway.
That's a great point, because like you can hear in the word logos where it's used, like after, like, in our own languages and other languages, like if you say biologist, within that is like biologos, like he who speaks of life, or geologos for geologists, it's like he who speaks of the stones. Like there's a combined idea of both speaking, but speaking with authority on a topic.
Right.
And so like a lot of our constructed words to explain someone who can speak on something with authority will often include the word logos within the compound word.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I find it interesting, even in this verse, thinking in terms of the complexity of the Trinity. The word was with God, and the word was God. I don't think there's any way for us to have both of those prepositions in our mind in a way that's simple to understand, right? You can't have any case where an object is both the same thing and also with itself. So you kind of got this sort of vague formulation of some of the complexity of the Trinity right here.
Yeah.
Should we do the next paragraph? There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. I'll tell you what, should we do the next bit as well? The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. It's really striking if you compare the way John is thinking and talking to the synoptic gospels. It's obvious that time has given quite a lot of maturity to these concepts. So we've got a bit to mull over and chew here. So does anybody want to jump in with something?
One thing I'll just mention is that, I guess you could say, I hadn't thought about it this way, but I guess you could say verses 1 through 13 here, it's basically like a nearly complete gospel, right?
Right.
It tells you, who Jesus is, where he came from, his relationship to the Father, right? And then it goes all the way to receiving him, right, and being born again, right? He's getting into what we associate with John 3:16, but here it is, right here in chapter 1, right? So it is not only a rather nicely compressed gospel. I used to hand out gospel tracts, as I mentioned on Millennial when I was young, on the streets. Yeah. You could just take this passage and here it is. Here's the gospel, or at least it's certainly a great starting point. Not only that, but it's got to be one of the most grand statements of the gospel that I've ever seen. I've heard people say the gospel all kinds of ways, but there's something about this that makes it just super mythic, right?
Oh, it's so wonderful, isn't it? I've heard it said that, what is it? Matthew shows Jesus as I'm forgetting now. So Mark is Jesus the servant, Luke is Jesus the perfect man, Matthew is Jesus the Messiah, the promised one, and John is Jesus as God. I think that's the formulation I've heard. So John's mission here is, I'm going to tell the biography of Jesus, and I'm going to drive towards the greatness of Jesus and his praiseworthiness. And there's tragedy in here as well. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. And I think that's probably speaking into some of what was going on at the time, this confusion and chaos that wasn't Jesus meant to bring about the new wonderful empire? Is Israel aren't we meant to throw off the shackles of Rome? What's happened?
Yeah.
And also, how come all the Jews have not become Christians? What's going on? But what? Yeah, that's part of
it's interesting because one of the defenses, it's in John, right? If I remember correctly, where he keeps saying the Jews when referring to, they're arresting him, and he just calls them the Jews, right? And I've heard people say, I know this sounds a little like, all the Jews are being blamed for this, but really here, if you look at it in context, it's talking about the leadership, and, in the same way that you'd say the Americans want to start a war with China. And that doesn't mean that I want to start a war with China, but that might mean the leaders want to, right? So I've heard that defense, but here we are in chapter 1, and he's saying he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. I mean, I haven't checked the Greek on this here, but the translation, his own people, suggests that it's not just talking about the leadership, right?
Comment, if it's appropriate. I'm not usually on these sorts of shows. It has to do with verses 12 and 13. I did not grow up a believer. I became a believer when I was 23. And this happened to be a time in my life when I was studying to be a therapist, and I was doing marriage and family therapy. And I was also studying under therapists who had degrees in divinity. And so I was learning how to counsel from the scriptures. And this verse really popped out at me at one point, because not only for the people I was counseling, but also for myself personally, as someone who was rejected by her own. My
Wow.
family, but when I became a Christian at age 23, I was not really speaking to my family. My parents are hippies that kind of never came out of it, and kind of an unsafe environment. So I felt quite a lot of rejection. But then it says here, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And as I meditated on that, I thought, well, if I'm born of God, I'm born of Christ's blood. And so I'm blood related to God. And it's a bond that no one can break. My parents can accuse me of being a part of a cult. I wasn't, but that accusation came. But I was born. I was born again. I was born of the blood of Christ, and so this was. It gave me a sense of safety and belonging, and nothing can break that bond. So, anyway.
Wow. I'd never made that connection before, that born again, like is it Nicodemus who gets told, you have to be born again? He's, what are you talking about? But an aspect of that new birth is that you have new parents, and the right here is conjuring up the concept that you can't, if you're the son of royalty, you inherit the father's possessions as a right, not you don't earn it. So in this case, and again, maybe one of the other things being addressed here is, well, how come there's a bunch of Gentiles who are part of this new movement? I thought Christianity was an offshoot of Judaism. What's going on? It's not about being a literal descendant of Abraham, because you're not born of the blood lineage, but through the will of God, which is quite a critical distinction to make, especially when people would have thought about religion at this time as being a result of you were born of the Jews, you're a Jew, you're born, and even today to some degree that's how people think of it, but it's not the way God thinks of it. He's opened it wide for anybody who hears this is a bit,
right, and this is very much 11 through 13. It's very much the grafting in stuff that Paul talks about, right? Well, I mean, Paul basically says the same thing as usual with Paul, with more words, that John says here from 11 to 13 when he talks about the Gentiles grafted in, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if there was. I mean, there's a couple of times now we've talked about feeling like there's actually quite a Greek influence on John.
Yeah, well,
on that.
It's debatable. I know Settler mentioned that like logos was a Greek, like it was a Platonic word. It was a word reserved for special philosophical thinking in Greek philosophy. But I'm not entirely convinced that at the time of Christ it had fully developed into the word that we understand now from later writers on the logos. I'm thinking especially with, like, for example, Emperor Aurelian with Stoicism. The word had a very close association for Stoicism, but I'm not entirely sure it had fully matured to the Stoic concept of the logos when this was written, or for that matter, if John himself was fully aware of the pagan concept around it. It's important to remember that Greek had become the lingua franca for most Jews in this region, as well as in Alexandria, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they understood the internalized meaning of all the words in the native speakers. These people were native speakers in their own way. In the same way that, like, if you go to Germany, almost everyone speaks English because they were occupied by the United States for a generation or two. That doesn't necessarily mean the English words have the same meaning as they have in England or in Great Britain. You can use the same words, like if a German were to use a word like militant or protester, this concept may have a different understanding than an American who might say Reuter or insurrectionist. Like there's concepts that don't translate where language spreads sometimes, and this is a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure if logos was being understood in the philosophical sense, but it obviously greatly helps the text that the Greeks understood it in a philosophical way, and they read it that way when it came into the native Greeks.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like Greek philosophy was pretty popular in the Eastern Mediterranean world at this period. And I mean, certainly it's true that the concept continued to develop after the time of Christ. But I mean that this isn't like the writings of Plato. This is certainly something that existed. After prior to the time of Christ. So yeah, I don't know. I I think it's hard to imagine. I'm not an expert on this. I could be wrong, but I think it's hard to imagine that John didn't know what the context of what he was writing.
Yeah, I only bring it up as an uncertainty because people have often mentioned, like, John's writing is oftentimes viewed as, at least I have found it to be the most childlike at times. John would be the youngest apostle, and so he's describing things from the perspective of his youth. Well, at least tradition has held that John was the youngest. And like in this text, you'll see childlike descriptions, like the disciple who cuddled with Jesus, or the disciple outrunning Peter at the end, who Jesus loved. Like, these are like kind of like juvenile descriptions, like haha, Peter outrun you. You don't really see juvenile like language like that in the other gospels, which leads me to think that the writer might be a little younger, or at the very least remembering younger memories. But then Genesis 1 is incredibly deep philosophically also, so it's hard to say.
Wasn't John written later than the other Gospels? Then I thought it was.
It was the last one written, and by some traditions it was written in response to some of the things the other Gospels hadn't covered. But it's this is why, like, I'm always debating in my head, is it's the last Gospel written, and yet it has the most juvenile, like, kind of experiences of like a childlike description of some things. I don't know how to square that.
Yeah, I'd always heard it was later, but now I'm wondering. I don't know the scholarly reason they assume that. It does feel like the Christology is more developed, whereas, for example, Mark feels like you're getting the first reporter on the scene who's just got the earliest accounts.
Yeah, Mark's CNN.
I gotta. This has triggered me. I absolutely reject all modern scripture dating. I think this is all just stuff dreamt up by atheists to
what's the traditional view?
The traditional view is that the first gospel was written in I can't remember if it's Hebrew or Aramaic, but either Hebrew or I think Hebrew. It was the Gospel of Matthew, and it was based on notes that Matthew kept from being a tax collector. During his time with Jesus,
he was the apostolic artist.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, I'm not saying that's like a matter of dogma or anything, but that's the traditional view, and I see no reason to reject it. And I consider the main reason for modern attempts to change those dates to be primarily based on materialist assumptions. Assuming that the Gospels can't be the authentic result of divine revelation, and making dates based on it. The main place where we really see that is how the temple always comes into this. That's assumed that that Matthew and Luke must have been written after the destruction of the temple, because there's no way Jesus could have predicted it. And like if you read what contemporary scripture scholars say, that is explicitly their justification. So I don't think these people are even remotely trustworthy, even a lot of the Christian ones.
Yeah, there's always this desire to, like, if your argument is, oh, this gospel couldn't possibly be written before 60 AD because it predicts the destruction of the temple and therefore has to be after the fact. I mean, you're framing it from an atheist perspective. Why should I trust you? Like, your frame is not mine. Your frame is in fact materialistic and not worth a dime to me. So no. Exactly. Like, Settler brings up an excellent point here. And this is something that you have to be more and more sensitive these days, because the more scholarship gets flooded into researching this, the more you have to be cautious of, does this person believe in divine revelation, or are they a materialist? Because if they're a materialist, they're going to structure and frame the Gospels incorrectly to a Christian view.
Well, like I said, even a lot of the Christian scholars, they want to like use the same tools that the atheists use. And I just don't consider a lot of these people to be trustworthy.
It's almost like they're the kind of Christians who would want to try to frame moral questions from a modern perspective rather than a historic perspective.
I feel torn on this. On the one hand, I do rationally agree that if there's not a good reason to question the traditional view, then you may as well stick. On the other hand, there's the part of my personality that loves wacky theories and wants to kind of rediscover, like, wouldn't we get this awesome new insight if we use these new techniques that have been discovered?
Well, I mean, this isn't like a wacky theory, though. This is the theory that academia is shoving down our throat. This is a theory you'll learn from a lot of Christians is Mark was the first one. Mark was the first one. Mark was the first one. You better believe it. What are you, an academia denier?
The majority view is that Q was first, and then
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
The Jesus Seminar, if you've ever heard of such a thing. Anyway, hey, one thing I just haven't dwelt on much in my own thinking on in this passage is verses 6-8, talking about John the Baptist, and I just raise it for comment in this grand narrative that starts with the creation of the world and then comes to, Jesus is the light, and we can be born of God through him. And this is pretty grand stuff. It almost seems like John the Baptist is sort of like not quite up on the level of grandiosity, but maybe that's because I misunderstand the significance of John. I mean, Jesus said he was the greatest of the prophets, right?
Yeah.
So, and in some sense, I guess John, in that sense, embodies the whole prophetic tradition as the culmination of it, or the terminus of it. And maybe that's why he's mentioned here, to bring in. Anyway, I'm totally just off the top of my head commenting, but I'm curious what y'all think. Why does John bring up John the Baptist in this grand narrative here?
Yeah, we tend to sort the prophets' importance based on how long their books are, don't we? Like Isaiah and Jeremiah wrote heaps versus
the major prophets and the minor prophets, right? Yeah. Right.
But when Jesus asks Peter, "Who do you think I am?" doesn't he say, "Some are saying you are John the Baptist"? So I guess people
Ezekiel.
at the time.
He says some say you're Ezekiel. Right,
Okay,
right.
yeah.
Just jumping in there from my perspective.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's because of the number of followers of John, because I think if you look at verse 8 there, it's something interesting. The writer's explicitly saying he was not the light. So almost trying to correct people's viewpoint. And the other reason why I'd say that is that if you look at some of the non-biblical sources talking around like some of the characters for the Bible, John the Baptist gets mentioned a few times as well. So he was a big enough character or historical figure to be picked up in some of the Roman sources. I think Tacitus, I'm going to say, mentions him, for example. So I think he is significant at the time, but probably in our context, we just see him as the precursor to Jesus, but I think he was a bigger deal. So.
Well, yeah, and I mean, from Isaiah, the new Exodus that John the Baptist brings about is the precursor to Christ. So you kind of have to mention that before you get to the story of Christ to fulfill the prophecy. There's also later on, I don't know if this is in the section we're doing today, but when John's in prison in the same chapter, there's a very interesting part that I don't think is normally really recognized, where the jailers ask him, who are you? And they like, are you the Christ? Are you? But one of the things they ask him is, are you the prophet? And why this is interesting is that this is something that Muslims bring up all the time, is the prophet like Moses from Deuteronomy. And that's who's being referred to here when they ask, "Are you the prophet?" That's just an important verse. I don't generally hear Christians talk about that part of this chapter usually.
Real quick, my wife needs to step away or go say goodbye. Right?
Yes, I've got farm chores to do.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you
And,
for having me. And
Have a fantastic Christmas.
thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so what I've got up here is the passage I was thinking of. Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And then the disciples say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But who do you say I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that's from Matthew 16. I thought that was interesting that there was a buzz around Jesus, and he was asking, why are people here? What do they think is going on?
Okay, maybe I'm overthinking it, Lambda. It's maybe it's as simple as maybe it's because, like I said, John is the greatest of the prophets, and he represents the prophetic tradition and all that. But also, maybe it's just as simple as it's another way in this passage, which is trying to establish that, Jesus is God. He is, he is the big thing we were waiting for, right? This is by bringing up John the Baptist, it's a way to say Jesus was not pointing to yet something else. He was it. He was the thing being pointed to, not yet another pointer, right? Follow? It's a way of establishing his sort of ultimateness in this passage, maybe. Maybe that's the way to come at it.
And of course, this would bring to mind Isaiah 40. A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare a way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So again, the voice is saying, prepare a way for who? For the Lord. And yet we all acknowledge that John the Baptist was preparing the way for Jesus. So I think it's another part of drawing that kind of connection.
Right. And I'm sure people steeped in early church history don't forget, but it's easy for a lot of us to forget that the early centuries of the church, right, Settlers' Lament, are marked by arguments over who exactly Jesus was, what exactly his nature was, right? That's the big debate. Is he?
Why didn't
is he a representative of God, or is he part? What exactly was Jesus, right? And so it seems like in a brief passage, we're getting a lot of pointers away from possible errors and towards the truth of Jesus's identity.
How come when we do a gospel presentation today, we might say something as simple as Jesus is God, he's part of the Godhead. We formulate it in this quite simple way, and yet the Bible feels the need to go on for pages of hinting and pictures and pointing. Are we oversimplifying things? Is this just the result that Jesus, you get the sense during his earthly ministry that he was a bit cagey about saying it straight out because his time hadn't yet come. He had to do his ministry before he got executed. And if he'd have come out swinging day one saying, I'm God, then he would have been crucified. And
that's part of it. There's also the classic narrative advice, right? Show, not tell, right?
So we're just clumsy modern oafs stumbling into beautiful truths.
I'm talking about Jesus' ministry, that Jesus is showing by what he does, right? Through action.
I just wonder if we should
nature. He shows the nature of his Father. And then at the end, he says, I am, right?
Well, I'm going to have to bring up our Muslim friends because I debate Muslims about this stuff a lot. And the Trinity is always like probably the main thing they want to talk about. And the issue you're going to get into is that God actually in the Bible has a lot more of a semantic range than you might suspect. So when I deal with Muslims and other non-Trinitarians, there's always two angles. One, when you point to verses that do just say stuff like Jesus is God. There is like Titus, for example, says that. Then they're going to say, well, that doesn't literally mean God. That just means God, like in the sense that in Exodus it says that Moses was a god to Pharaoh, and modern translations will translate it as Moses was like a god to Pharaoh, but that is not what the Hebrew or Greek says. It very clearly just says Moses was a god to Pharaoh. So that's true and valid. Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, whoever. The Bible can use the term God to not literally mean the creator of the universe. So just pointing to like a passage that says Jesus is God isn't enough to really prove that. That's why these other ways of proving Jesus is God is important. That when we say God, we mean the one unique God, not just a really powerful person or not just like a super angel or something like that. Because
Yeah.
that could be interpreted as what is meant by God. Because like Jehovah's Witnesses will say, yes, Jesus is God. And by God we mean he's like the first created creature of God. So yeah. So but the reason I think why it is fine for us to say Jesus is God to people is because the intent is clearer with what's established in the Bible.
That was fantastically articulated. Is this how you become world famous? That was great.
I mean, unfortunately, I
that
get
is very
terrible views when I do stuff on religion on my channel. It's why it's still mostly like political, social stuff.
That is very helpful because that helps us understand the significance of the opening shot there, right? That the word was God, the word was with God. All these things are to say, again, we're talking about he's there from the beginning with God. He isn't something later. He is an ultimate, right? He's not something. He isn't pointing to something else. He is the light, right?
Yeah, and it clearly, the fact that it's in verse 9, the true light, shows that, and that he was not the light, means that must have been part of John's interest. And it's confusing that it's John talking about somebody else called John. But he's saying, some people seemed to think that John the Baptist was the light, and he wasn't. He was pointing to the light.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely had followers that they mentioned several times. Just one little nuance I liked here is that he came as a witness, and with our association with the idea of the witness, a witness sees something and then sort of reports back. He's seeing something that is yet to happen. So it's kind of like some kind of this kind of juxtaposition of the witness. I think is quite interesting. And again, that all might believe through him. Again, something like the light you'd expect people to see, but it needs to be pointed out to people. The way has to be prepared, which again I think is also interesting.
It's quite a pile of metaphors by the time you get to 13, isn't there? You've got word, light. You've got something that you receive, something that you believe in, and then being born, and then flesh, and so the quantity of jargon. I'm just thinking, if I had put this together as a gospel presentation, I'd get a lot of feedback quite quickly that I needed to de-jargon.
But that's the poetry. That's the beauty.
Yeah.
But I know that Cringe was saying that it's childish. I think this is a very complicated and very rich, almost like literary prose. Is how I read it, as opposed to, like you said, the babblings of a small child.
Oh, I didn't mean babbling. Like I meant like it reads like a child telling a story or something. Like
Mark's usually the one who gets accused of having bad Greek, from what I hear.
Well, yeah. Yeah, like this is like childlike in the sense of like, if I was dealing with a child who wanted to tell me about something really cool he saw, this is how I would imagine it described. So like, although I do accept that like, the opening poem here is rather sophisticated. I was talking about like later on with like, oh yeah, and the apostle outran the old Peter, or like, the apostle cuddled with Jesus, or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's do the next bit. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Oh, complicated stuff. Also, as a programmer, I was 100% keeping track of the amount of opened punctuation marks. At this point, we were about 4 deep, and then they all close at once, as an aside. So thoughts on this paragraph?
Oh, real quick. This is a minor point probably, but this thing, he who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. And then there's another place Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which seems to me a claim to divinity when he says that, right? So this is something that was quite foreign to my own thinking, which is that what comes earlier is greater or more important. Probably because I'm, a 20th century American. It's probably not such a weird thing for more traditional cultures. But I remember talking to a close Jewish friend, a non-believing Jewish friend, and they were telling me how, the farther back you go, sort of the mightier they are, and Abraham could just shoot lasers out of his eyes or something. It was really weird stuff. But anyway, but the import of it though was that the older, the more grand, important, higher rank. So anyway, I feel like we're getting a hint of that sort of thinking here when John says, I can't. He came after me in a birth order sense, right? But he was before me, and therefore he outranks me, right? So there's this precedence of time ranking thing. Again, it feels still, even though I've absorbed it over the years a little bit, it still feels culturally a little bit foreign to me. That just, he who comes later is less important than he who comes earlier.
We do have the term OG, which has kind of come into the vernacular as a resurrection of this idea, right? Because you were around from the beginning, you're more significant. So I think there is something intuitive about it that we kind of, in our modern enthusiasm for throwing off tradition, put aside. But I think there's a sense in which we do deep down understand the idea that there's significance to being more original.
Yeah, and just to belabor the point slightly, of course, this points back to the right at the beginning, right, where it's establishing that Jesus is there from the beginning. All the things that are created, meaning everything we can think of, basically, right? Everything we can see, everything we are, all these created things, he's before those. So he outranks, the sun, the moon, all the things that, say the pagan might be tempted to worship, right? As well as the king, the emperor, he outranks all those things because he came before them. These things were created through him. So again, it's that temporal ranking thing.
When when God appears in the burning bush, which some would say was a theophany, and Moses says, "Who should I say? What's your name? How do you identify yourself? How do I explain who you are?" And he says, "You can say that I am has sent you." He's kind of defining himself in difference to every other being as ever present. It almost makes me think of an ontological argument, right? The necessity of God's existence is unique. It doesn't matter when you go in history or whatever else exists, you can bank on the fact that God is there and exists. You don't need tenses to talk about God's presence because he just, as a raw fact of existence, that's one way you can sort of answer the question of who God is. You could try pointing towards him in terms of his deeds. He's the creator, he's the savior. But fundamentally, before anything else was, he is.
I want to go back to Lambda's bringing up of OG there. When are you going to be releasing a paper on Christian understanding through rap vernacular?
There is this.
When Luke brought up OG, I thought, oh man, I can just see the cringe T-shirts in the Christian bookstore. Please no. I mean, it's a great insight, and I love how he brought it in. But it's like let's let it stop right here, and let's not merchandise it.
Original God, not
right.
None of your Baal nonsense.
Right.
It's always a bit confusing to me when I get in conversations with people who talk about God as having been invented by the Jewish people in response to religions that pre-existed that, because it's so different from my worldview, where for me, God created the world and then there were these other religions that splintered off. And it's almost so different that the conversation grinds to a halt, because neither of us have quite properly can get outside of our own frames.
Well, right. Lewis was big on this, right? The reflections of truth, divine truth, and the nature of God that are scattered across cultures and languages and traditions and myths, right? Yeah, the Tao, right? I love how that worked for Lewis, which is that it literally just flipped. The polarity flipped. Like he saw the connections before he was a believer, right? He could see those connections, and he saw them in the modern way, like you're saying, how man invented God, that kind of stuff, right? And then, with his conversations with Tolkien and so forth, and just, the Holy Spirit, right? The polarity flipped, and all the things he had been seeing were still there. But now the causal flow reversed for him. And he saw that, all these things that I was loving in Norse myths and all this stuff he was so well versed in, right? All these things that were calling to me, he called them lies breathed through silver, right? And the breathed through silver, forget the lies part for a moment. The breathed through silver spoke of his emotional reaction, that he saw these beautiful things in the myths that were calling to him on a deep level. And Tolkien basically said, consider that they're not lies breathed through silver, they're glints of truth that have been muddled by, pagan tradition and stuff. But it's truth at the kernel, not a lie at the kernel. Anyway, I always thought that was lovely, how that exact thing you're talking about, he saw all those connections that all the secular scholars see. He just realized that the causal direction was the reverse of what they were saying.
Just going back to the text, I just want to look at verse 14 a second, because I think it's really interesting poetically. Again, I'm sorry to keep hammering on about this, but this idea again, that the word became flesh. So again, something that's immaterial has become material. So again, that transitionary like device, which again is poetic. It dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. And again, this is like almost hooking into the witnessing from John the Baptist again. We have now become witnesses of our own. And then again, there's a cleverness with the glory, because glory is often described as like a bright light or a shiningness to it. So there's mirroring from that kind of a earlier piece as well. So it's a very structurally advanced piece.
It's so sophisticated, isn't it? And yeah, so beautiful. It's somehow achieved both great complex philosophical depths, whilst also maintaining the poetry that's usually only possible with simplifying. But this feels both totally graspable, and you could read this and worship, but also somehow unfathomable and beyond. Like I sense there's ideas deep enough here that I'll never quite grok them, no matter how hard I meditate.
There's like a holiness to it. There is a mystery to the passage as well. So yeah.
Talking of how Pauline some of this feels, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. We've got this idea that there's the old covenant. Sometimes you see it tracing particularly to Abraham, or in this case, the fullest, most complex version of the agreement with all the bylaws and do this on a Tuesday and don't mix your fabrics and so on that Moses brought, and just the impossibility of keeping that law, and then the necessity for grace, grace being the upsides, the good stuff from God, but without having merited it. No, you haven't earned it. We've all received grace upon grace. And then truth is interesting. I guess to me this is filling in some of the mystery that was missing, some of the things. Doesn't it say somewhere, even angels desired to know, wished that they, before Jesus came, there were angels who were wondering the things that have now been revealed to us. So yeah, let's not forget what a privileged position we are to be able to read this. Any other comments on this 14 to 18 section?
What all are we covering? I don't remember how far.
Well, I'm conscious that we're coming up on an hour. Since we've talked quite a bit about John the Baptist, I'm keen to carry on and maybe we'll stop at 28. But I don't know what the mood is with you guys. Are you up for doing a little bit more?
I think if we did just this next John the Baptist section, 19 through 28, that would be perfect, and then I could actually participate in the whole thing, which I would love. But before we leave it, I just wanted to go back to 1 to 18 for a moment. That's kind of the grand section, right?
Yes.
It starts to become a little more prosaic in the following section, I think, right? Starts to feel a little bit more like the other gospel accounts, just telling you what happened when and who said what. Whereas this is like a grand philosophical poem or something like transcendent poem in 1 through 18. Anyway, I just wanted to echo a little bit of what the personal sharing my wife did, which is that for those of us who have, as the passage here talks about, received Christ and have become children of God, I think part of the power of meditating on verses 1 through 18 and who Jesus is, his rank, his importance, and our relationship with him, I guess I could see this as not only being a sort of a grand mystical narrative, but also something that can be personally encouraging, right? This is not something that we talk about much these days, though I'm not entirely clear why sometimes. But at the time of Christ, there were people who were possessed by demons, right? And he cast the demons out. No one's possessed by demons anymore. They just have chemical imbalances and so forth in our materialist age, right? Somehow demon possession just dropped off the map. I don't know what year that was. Was it 200 AD, 1500 AD? I've never heard when that happened. But anyway, somehow between then and now, we see probably the same sorts of behavior, outward manifestation, but we interpret it in a materialist sense. Where at the time of Christ, not just Jesus, right? He comes to town and people say, "Hey, this guy's possessed by a demon. Can you do anything?" Right? So other people are perceiving these things. So if you're dealing with that sort of thing, it's frightening, right? And I have, it just so happens, been witness to something like that. When you're dealing with something like that, you realize that there is real spiritual power at play in our world. And it is at times like that I think a passage like this first part of John can truly provide you strength and comfort to recognize that, wow, I'm dealing with like evil with capital E here, you know, but I have a relationship with Jesus, and Jesus was with God from the beginning. All created things come through, all these things that John says. It feels like a good passage to have memorized if you can, to bring that back to your mind and go, okay, whoa. That was a little scary, what I've just confronted here. But I am with, Jesus is with me and I'm with him. And this is who Jesus is. And I can stand on that solid foundation, right? As I face, spiritual evil, which has been a topic lately. The whole issue of evil, I think, has been coming up in our sphere quite a bit, even from people who are not Christians. They're using the word evil a lot, correctly.
I think evil is something we intuitively understand. We know it without needing it to be proven to exist. And when we're told in many situations that evil is somehow an illusion or it's relative or whatever, we're given a choice. Do we close our selves? Do we take the active step of blinding ourselves, as we see in Romans 1, to what we actually understand that is like directly divinely revealed to us, and become fools, thinking ourselves to be wise? Or do we kick back against that and follow the true light as we're seeing revealed here? And evil loves the dark, loves confusion. And we need to be out there in the culture, not just keeping this light to ourselves, but who takes a light and puts it under a bowl, but instead you hold it up. And we need to I think we need to really encourage this, blast back the darkness that evil tries to create, and point out, no, this that's happening around us is evil. We could all see it. And if you're going to do evil, you're going to do it with the full glory of Jesus, like shining in your face and making you feel ashamed. Let's do the next little section, and we'll right. And this is the testimony of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I'm not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie." These things took place in Bethany, across the Jordan, where John was baptizing.
Just a quick question: Is there any church traditions around John and miracles at all? Was it just him baptizing people?
I mean, not that I know of. The main tradition I know of is the relic of his head. But that's about it. I don't know anything about miracles specifically.
I was just wondering. Obviously, they're sending out a group of a task force of priests and Levites to try and find out what's going on with this guy. Was it just the baptizing that? I guess living in this ascetic life.
Baptizing was pretty normal practice for the Jewish people. It's like, most of the Old Testament's rules regarding cleanliness can be categorized as a form of baptism. It was a lot had to do with his acts, like his words, his bold words, and things going on around those around him.
Yeah, yeah, and calling people to repentance and directly, saying that he is the new that he's bringing about the new Exodus from Isaiah, especially though on baptism that's a very important point that you brought up, Advent Walker, that that baptism was a established practice. This is something I don't think many people are aware of. That both in not only Jewish but even in Gentile cultures, baptism was a quite common practice. It wasn't just some new thing that came about with the time of Christianity.
I did not know that about the non-Jewish tradition of baptism. That's interesting.
Well, the non-Jewish traditions of baptism usually involved baptism by blood rather than by water.
I mean, there was water. I don't really know about blood baptism, but there was definitely Gentile water baptism. I mean, I think the sort of symbolism is
the point of Settlers' Lament that would have been religiously significant that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of symbolism in baptism is sort of obvious. In like washing away. I mean, I even, this is probably kind of weird. It might even be TMI. But like every time I have a shower, I kind of feel like it's almost a spiritual experience being clean. So I can definitely see how baptism is symbolic of that, especially for people who back then would not have bathed nearly as much as we do.
Yeah.
It's actually recorded later in John that when Jesus shows up in the same area where John the Baptist had previously been hanging out, the people said John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true. So it'd probably be difficult to create a tradition that John did signs after that.
Sorry, it just hit me. Like one of the big reasons why John the Baptist was listened to with authority was because his father was the high priest for a few years back, if you might recall, from the Gospel of Luke. So this
is like the rebel son.
But it's just interesting that he catches so much interest and obviously has a following, but he's just effectively a crazy guy living off Locust, away from everyone else.
So like John the Baptist would have been like 30 years prior. His dad was the high priest of Israel, who specifically was the one I think who I forget what exactly that the father was. It's in the Gospel of Luke, but like this is the son of someone who's considered like the upper echelons of like temple authority and
into the Holy of Holies, doesn't he? That's where he
and like he too was born a miracle. His mother was too old to have a child, so there's a lot of parallels with him and Abraham. Remember what the description is of his. Remember what the description is in Luke, that the Baptist's mother was well over the years of having children, yet had a child. So there was symbolism there to Abraham. The father was a high priest. So like they think, well, your father's a high priest and your mother is fulfilling signs and wonders like Sarah did. So you're clearly supposed to be someone in this story because God has provided multiple signs of your coming. Are you the Messiah we've been working for? If he's having the signs that are equal to that of Abraham, then they would presume that there is something on the level of Abraham about to happen.
I wonder if it's just worth quickly dashing over to Luke 7 when there's this interesting kind of confrontation that happens with some of his disciples.
And it's also worth mentioning that the father, when he was a high priest, after he regained his voice, claimed to have been visited by an angel. So there's a lot of parallels here. And of course, this entire family here is blood related to Jesus Christ himself. And so Jesus too would have had some limelight coming from John the Baptist by being related.
There's this interesting rebuke. John the Baptist comes along and he doesn't eat bread or drink any wine, and he's accused of having a demon. And then Jesus comes along and he's eating and drinking, and then they say he's a glutton, a drunkard, and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. I love that. We see a bit of that today, don't we? It's like there's no way to win if you get put in these situations where whatever you choose to do, you're going to get accused. You're given a binary choice, and either option is a lose. Well, I tell you what, rather than diving into that too far, that stands as homework for the viewers. Any other thoughts directly on this passage from John?
Just to note that this is a fairly nice transition, really, from the 1 through 18, right, where the grand narrative, which mentioned John the Baptist, right, as part of that narrative, and then it shifts from that not very concrete. 1 through 18 is not very concrete, right? And one of the things that has always struck me reading the Bible is it has those moments that are sort of grand or apocalyptic or visions of heaven, right? But those are actually relatively rare. I think people who don't know the Bible might think that that's what it is 90% of the time. That's not true. Most of it is more like what we see here, these guys were sent from the Pharisees. It mentions parenthetically, right? Like it's very date, time, place, who said it, right? Where they said it. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's being mythical and just giving you archetypes. It's talking about actual people who were talking to each other, and it's telling you what they were saying and what their connections were to each other, right? It's very
which makes it almost impossible to forge. I mean, all of those things would be pretty immediately debunked if they were made up,
right.
On many different levels.
Right.
But the expectation for most people that religious literature is this mythic or sort of simple sayings, those genres, that is what non-biblical religious texts are like generally, almost entirely.
I'm not as much of an expert as I wish I was, but yes, I gather that the Quran does not read quite like,
I mean, the other...
This sort of just the facts, ma'am thing that you get throughout much of the scriptures. It's literally, and then Paul was in this city and he had these people with him and he met up with these and then he was working as a tent maker. It's all very almost prosaic in a way, very grounded in prosaic details.
And the further you move through history from the events, the apocryphal Gospels are likewise become more mythic in their quality. The later the forgery is, the more abstract and crazy the descripted events are, or the less it tries to even portray a biography, and it's simply sayings of Jesus or something like that.
Yeah, so anyway, I'm just pointing out that John here goes from that epic poem or whatever you want to call it from 1 to 18 and starts grounding it very quickly. And, this John the Baptist guy I'm talking about, here he is talking to people of his time and here's what they talked about. And right. So it's grounding it in historicity. And it's saying that grand stuff I did for 18 verses. Now we're going to talk about it and like what actually happened and who said what to whom and who, what, when, where, why kind of stuff.
Just riffing off that again. Again, this is maybe reading too much into it, but again in Greek classic epic work, you always begin the hero's journey with an invocation at the start. So if you go to the Odyssey or anything like that, you have this kind of like you're trying to bring the kind of muses, etc. But again, there's almost like this kind of epic introduction to it, where it's this like poem form before you then hit the kind of epic, the most epic hero of all time kind of thing. So
yeah. It does feel somehow like a stage play, doesn't it? That you have it's like the Greek chorus in communication with this prophetic character who's saying, "He's coming," and the people say, "Who's coming?" And he says, let me tell you, he's amazing. He's so much greater than I. Just wait till you see him. Setting up the anticipation for when the main character is going to enter on the scene. But in some ways, that's literally what was happening. The world stage of history was being prepared for this epic good and evil conflict. So it's perhaps better to say that the stage plays reflect the real events than that the real events reflect the stage play, right? Mm. Yes. Among you stands one who you do not know. I don't think that's implying that Jesus was incognito pretending to be a Pharisaical messenger. Like they started looking at each other.
Yeah,
Great.
I guess the only other thought here is just the role of the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, right, who was prophesied, and John the Baptist fulfilling that prophecy. I guess I'm not sure I've ever had quite a firm grasp on, and maybe there didn't need to be one, but why was there a John the Baptist? You know, why did someone come ahead of Jesus, preparing the way? In many cases, just directly preparing the hearts, you know, sort of spiritually transforming or partially transforming, right, or readying people's hearts who literally went on to be Jesus's disciples or followers, right? So very personal, you know, people who were touched by John's ministry then were literally slid over to Jesus and to his ministry. And I don't know, maybe it's just that why shouldn't Jesus have help in his ministry? I don't know. I feel like maybe there's a cosmic significance I haven't gotten yet.
To me, it speaks to his kingly nature. I think the preparation is the same that you would do if a royal or a person of some importance was coming to visit a town or a city. You'd first send ahead the messengers who would give sort of fair warning, you know, look shipshape. Someone, you know, you want to be ready to cheer as they come into the city or whatever. That's what the passage in Isaiah says to me, at least, is prepare the way for the Lord, and we see that come again when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and there's the laying down of the palm fronds, just a kind of a great procession, like if I guess a Roman king was, or a Roman military leader was coming back after winning a battle. Like wouldn't they have had a similar procession into a city? There's probably tactical reasons as well why you don't send your commander ahead of the army. You first send the scouts or whatever. I don't know. Anybody else got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what I was going to say, and I was very angry at you for stealing my point. But no, yes, that I think that's exactly it. This is something we of course consistently see in the Gospels and the New Testament as a whole, and the whole Bible, the Old Testament too, is the kingly nature of Christ. So I definitely think that's the case. And I think an important thing we see here with John the Baptist preparing the way is a sort of way that a lot of Christians misunderstand Christ's kingship. And this isn't a Protestant Catholic thing. What I mean by this is a lot of Christians the way that they see the kingship of Christ is that, like, if we try really hard, we can get Christ into that king position. If we can convince enough people, if we can convert enough people, then Christ will really be king. But what we see here is that, like, they're doing the victory procession right at the beginning, before any of the converts are won. The Christ's general and Christ are parading through the streets. Because as Isaiah says, the increase of his government will have no end. Not, if we can convince enough people, Christ will govern the world. Christ is king, no matter what you want to think about it, no matter what you want to do. And our job isn't to go out there and get enough signatures. Our job is to go out there and tell people he's in charge. You can either be with him or you can be against him.
And talking of the kingship of Christ.
Sorry, to clarify, I am of course not giving advice there on how best to phrase evangelism. Until anyone says that's not the best way to try to evangelize someone. It's not the point.
Man, your detractors have such feminine beta voices. By the sounds
I know
of
it's very strange how my detractors always look like soy jacks and my allies always look like gigachads.
Maybe there's something to learn about. I was going to say, talking of Christ's kingship, the one message of his ministry was that the kingdom of God was at hand, and as I feel like I keep saying on stream, the confusion at the time was whether a king must have a material kingdom, no? Like, what's going to be the geographic boundary of the kingdom of God? But he was talking about the place he would have dominion is in people's hearts, and the approaching triumphant, glorious battle that he was about to win was not a political, earthly, secondary, who cares kind of battle like everyone is normally obsessed with. It's the way more important spiritual battle where he triumphed over actual evil, and the kingdom of God in that sense, if you think of it as if it were a real... Actually, when we... Crinchwalker, were you there? I was talking before the stream with... about it, is the spirit of the Roman Empire still around in its influences over this, that, or the other? But I think in a very real sense, we should think of ourselves not as being primarily members of a country or a movement or whatever, but as being, our identity is in Christ, and that's our kingdom that we belong to. He's our king. We are in the nation, or whatever terms you prefer to think of. Like, we're soldiers for God, and as long as there's Christians on the planet, then that's our core identity and cause.
Yeah, I mean, like, you're first a citizen of heaven, and then you're second a citizen of where you are, and I think that helps you. I think that's a very useful element of the scripture, because it kind of pushes you to be to reprioritize where and what you're doing, because one of the main features of like American Christianity for the last 30 to 40 years has been blind patriotism to the United States and its military objectives. Luckily, this is starting to wane as a series of failures start to mount up, and people start to awaken that God is not with us in these endeavors. So I don't know for sure if that's finally going to correct itself, but you have like, a generation of younger and older Christians, both who are starting to wake up to where their first citizenship is. It's not the United States and its military allies. It's to God and His goals, His church, His kingdom, in Christ's kingship, and rediscovering that. I'm almost reminded of this is YouTuber called the Franklin, who's very good, and he mentions that one of the, like, from he's more speaking from a slightly more secular view, that like one of the best things a right-wing person can do is to start imagine themselves as a foreigner in their homeland, and what would a foreigner do in the things that they see. Well, they probably wouldn't get involved too much with some of the things that are happening in the mainstream, because it's not their country, it's not their concern, but they'd probably invest in a lot of the things that create for them a healthy community that they can integrate into in the process of, like, quote unquote immigrating or integrating. I had this conversation with my mom a lot of times too. I'm constantly, my mom is in her 70s and grew up in the post-war reality. and in her experience, she was pretty indoctrinated into the American 1960s 1970s like growing up perspective of America as the best country in the world, and she finds a hard time rejecting that now that America is no longer the best country in the world and falling from grace. I mean, the freedoms America offers remain the best if long as you're in the right state, but like that the breaking of that idol is very hard, and I keep telling my mom, the country you grew up in doesn't exist anymore, and this is always hard for her to accept because she doesn't like hearing that, right? Like, it's hard hearing that. It's a tragedy hearing that, but like in many ways, it's something that the first church, the early church, knew this because the early church, a lot of them didn't leave Palestine, but what did they see in their lifetimes in the span of like 60 years? They saw their Messiah come and be executed, which is a very tragic thing. But then they also saw him rise from the dead, and they proceeded to see 30 years of decline culminating when the destruction of the temple, the singular heart of their culture and identity. So they experienced decades of prolonged decline and ultimate destruction, and they found themselves in a land that, though they hadn't moved, it just wasn't the country they grew up in anymore. Now it was something else entirely. The culture was different. The language was different. Even the architecture was different or straight up destroyed. And coming to terms with that, this is a common Christian experience that I think harkens back to the new Exodus that Christians will experience in their lifetime. You can't hold onto these idols of citizenship and nationality well, maybe nationality, but you can't hold on to these idols that especially in this age are in the process of being toppled. You'll just always experience heartbreak if you do. But if you come into the context with the correctly oriented loves, if you will, common Americanism, the correctly oriented loves of Christ first, on your family second, or your church to third or second there, depending on who you ask. This allows you to recontextualize the decline around you as potential and things to repair rather than things to flee from. I might just be rambling a bit here, but I think that's like something to say.
Well, it does remind me of a conversation I had with my dad, where I was giving him some revisionist history on some, American president or whatever that's usually we're supposed to admire, and he's absorbing what I'm saying, and he says, "Will you leave me no heroes?" and I said, I forget how I responded, but the point was, if your heroes are going to be politicians, then you're setting yourself up for disappointment, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, so Lambda, Luke, I have to call you
Yes.
Luke. Get used to that. Speaking of Luke, I wanted to, since you gave it this title and it's Christmas time, I felt like we needed to do a connection to Christmas a little more directly.
Ooh,
And
yes.
even though I can't read in the awesome way that you read, let me read from Luke real quick, okay? Because this is what came to mind, Luke 2. This is what came to mind in terms of an aspect of the Christmas story that really connects to the glory, the Jesus revealed in glory that we're seeing in John 1, right? So starting in verse 8, there were shepherds out in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night, and an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. I don't know what the glory of the Lord shining around them, but the shining, it implies to me that things were very bright. Okay. And they were filled with great fear. And as I always say to my children, what does the angel always say? And they would say, "Don't be afraid." And I said, why does he say that? Because it's terrifying to face an angel of God. Okay. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." And suddenly, and this is what I was building up to, and suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God, right? So it's bright and there's angels all over the place. These shepherds are like, what is going on, right? And they're saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." So that's the scene that came to mind as we're reading John 1, right? This is he who was with God from the beginning. He is coming, and the angels are glorifying this amazing thing that's happening.
There's I think there's this one piece of art done by Gustave Doré, which one of my favorite artists, but I'll post his art of this. I think it's this particular scene, but it's a beautiful thing. Here, Landra, I posted it in there, but it's a beautiful rendition of it. That's probably not the best quality image, if you want to put it up there. But
Yes, just give me a
sorry.
sec. Copy it across. Here we are.
Yeah, so I'll scroll in. Like the appearance of the multitudes of angels, like unveiling themselves before the night sky, and just like the shock of that. Of course, you'd be afraid seeing something like that. And doors. This is from Dante specifically, but it's meant to like mimic that particular scene. Like there's this idea of like oh, sorry, go on.
The closest we get these days to this sort of thing, right, is in an X-Files moment or something, right?
Where
the appearance of brightness at night, aliens. You're filled with awe, but also fear. Are they going to destroy me? What is this? I mean, that's probably the closest we get in our current culture to having some inkling of this experience that's described in Luke, right, and depicted here by Doré.
Want to hear a freaky experience I had that was sort of like that? It might be off topic, but it's kind of similar to Christmas in the sense of like the fear that you feel at the scene. That was a question, not a statement. I don't know if there's enough time for it.
Well, sorry, say it again. What do you want to do?
I have a bit of a spooky experience that happened, where it's kind of sort of like that, which might help explain why it's terrifying, but it might just be like a dream.
Can you do it in 60 seconds?
Sure. I woke up one night. I was kind of depressed. Something was. I forget what was happening. I'm not gonna go into that. But a kind of a column of light was present and tried to speak. But the problem is that every time it tried to speak, it was like every word in a paragraph was spoken at once, and it shocked me in fear. And then I woke up. The thing is, when I woke up, my ears were popped, and I still can't explain why they were popped, because the dream shouldn't pop your ears. But like that's just like a kind of like an example of like the kind of things I envision it as like these are things that are not meant to really be comprehended by the human mind. It's one of the reasons why I have a fascination for art in this area of like trying to express in like a plane of art like what's going on here. But these are like things that like these shepherds must have like wanted to flee for the hills that they were on, basically.
Has anybody seen the Dune movie that just came out recently? There's a scene in it when the Bene Gesserit ship leaves, and as it's ascending, there's this sound of sort of female choir voices, but all swirling, dissonant. With Hans Zimmer's just done this crazy job on the audio and that, and it's quite terrifying, but also mesmerizing and wondrous at the same time. That scene is, I think, the closest depiction I've ever seen to what I imagine this would be like to experience.
It shows up a lot in art of like many films, like the classic like 2001 scene of like just all the voices singing when the monolith appears to try and express what like fear is. For some reason, whenever the human mind hears 1,000 voices like that, it just all at once in alignment with praise or something, it sends a shiver. A lot of orchestra. If you go to an orchestra and they're all saying the same thing in like that, those tones that like are like gothic in tone and nature, it just brings up some primal fear in your heart.
Let's go around and everybody gets one last chance to either make a comment on the passage or to shill something or say whatever else you like, and then I'll finish. I'll tell you what, I'll finish by. Oh, yeah.
I already did my bit, so go ahead.
Great. Settler's Lament.
So several things. It might take a while. So first, I needed to debunk something you said earlier, Lambuda. It's been a while since that point, but I am seething and coping that much over it that must be debunked. So you said something. I think this is a pretty common error. That like the the change that Jesus came to make, like the battle he came to win, which is true, it is the conquering death and sin. Yes, totally true. Endorse, thumbs up. But you juxtapose that to like conquering the Roman Empire. Well, one, it's a historical fact that Christians did conquer the Roman Empire. Unless you're going to say that Christianity was corrupted by the time of Constantine, and most historical Protestants are going to try and claim the Council of Nicaea as their own, not as a Roman Catholic invention. So I think it's just a historical fact that Christ objectively did vanquish the Roman Empire. I think unless you're like an IFB or something like that, I think it's hard to even dispute that.
Yes, I think my point was that wasn't what happened during Jesus' lifetime.
That's fair. But with that said, I think there's a really sort of like central error here that a lot of Christians, again, this isn't like a Protestant Catholic thing, have with the kingship of Christ also again. And it's that like when we hear about Herod and he kills all the babies to try and kill Jesus, often the Christian response to that is, oh, that's so like silly. Like we weren't a threat to Herod. Christ wasn't a threat to Herod. No, Christ was. He was a really big threat to Herod. He was the biggest threat to Herod ever. He was also Herod's salvation, obviously. Probably an offer that he didn't take Christ up on. But Christ is a threat to all the powers of the world. Christianity isn't just like this weird thing we do in our free time. And it's not just a purely spiritual thing. It's not we're not just trying to save souls. We are, but this isn't just about like preaching the gospel to people. This is about our entire lives. This is about everyone's entire lives. And it is a threat to the powers of the world if they're not conformed to what Christ wants them to be. So yeah, I mean that's the point. I of course I'll also have to shill. But is there anything you want to say to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. The concept that we can put religion in a nice little box in a secular state where it won't have any influence over politics, and it's ultimately real Christians are going to at some point be backed up to a wall where they are being asked, where does your true allegiance lay? And the powers that be will discover that the Christians really are not going to take it lying down, right? So I think there is a there is a potential issue when people try to live out their Christianity in such a happy, clappy, friendly way that it's going to never be a problem to anybody. When in reality, the call, I think, is to influence society. And I don't know if I'm dodging exactly what you said. I think the in terms of as a political project, should we aim to have a Christian country? I wouldn't be against it, right? I think that I don't think it's it doesn't appear to be a primary concern that the Bible is looking to address. So I think that's probably why there's a perception that Christians mostly should be thinking about how to live under an oppressive regime, because most of the New Testament was written in that context about how should we, in difference to the Old Testament, which is full of an explanation of how to run society, the New Testament is, let's assume that you're in a society being run by other people. How should you behave? Settler, why don't you come back and say whether you think I've completely dodged the question?
No, I mean, I think everything you said is reasonable. I don't want to like extend this argument too much. This isn't like the point of the stream or anything, but I don't violently disagree with anything you've said.
Okay, we may hit the point of violence at another day.
But I do, of course, have to shill.
Sorry. Yeah, please.
Yes, yeah. Okay, everyone. I mean, first, the most important shilling: submit to the Pope. frequent the sacraments, pray the rosary. Um, you know, even I want to make an appeal, especially at Christmas time, for anyone watching this that may be like an ex-Christian or a lapsed Christian. Even if you're not going to join the one and only Catholic Church, even if you are a lapsed Protestant or something, please go back to church. That's the first thing you always have to do. I bump into a lot of lapsed Christians on the internet where they want to like talk to me about like theology or something, and they're not going to church every Sunday. And I want to slap them. I would slap them if I was talking to them IRL. So even of course I want you to submit to the Pope. But even if you're not going to do that, please attend a heretical church if that's the only thing you're willing to do. Stop putting it
Christmas has brought out such a mild side to you, Settler.
No, I want to remind everyone I love all heretics. I really don't know why this is always so difficult for people to understand. That I can love Protestants and I can also call them out for being heretics. Same thing with EOs. But yeah, no, I mean, but yeah, so there's that. Subscribe to Settlers Lament, donate. I have 2 streams coming up in the next couple of days. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. Pharaoh.
Yeah, nothing to really shill my side, but yeah, just maybe just spend some time reflecting on the kind of language and the beauty of the words themselves as much as the meaning as well that we read in the Bible. I think that's often maybe we are too analytical sometimes and need to be a bit aesthetic with our reading. So that was a very enjoyable stream. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for coming. Stephen.
Well, I guess I did what I thought.
Oh, yes, you said you were already done.
Did the closing thing there. I guess the only thing to mention is that our last show on my channel of the year will be this Thursday, and we'll be judging our contest that we do each year. This year, it's the design of flags.
So I entered this.
Should be great fun. Yeah, should be great fun. A lot of great entries. And
what's this contest? I want to hear about this.
It's well, last year we did currency design, and we had Semyagog and Pharaoh as judges, and it ended up being much more fun than I expected because Semyagog and Pharaoh decided to really go for it and not just be silly, but really like they're at their jobs judging, explaining why this design works and this design doesn't. Right, Pharaoh? It was great.
It was kind of a good cop, bad cop situation where I was trying to bring the best out of people and encourage them, and Semyagog was like destroying the dreams of many a young illustrator. It was very sad.
Yes, it was glorious. So hopefully we'll set up a similar dynamic this year with this flag contest where people are designing flags for real or imagined, city states or whatever. And in particular, we've encouraged people to create a lore, to give some background, not just a design, but also a little bit of prose to explain, what does this flag represent, what's it for. And some people really went nuts with that. So there'll be some reading of lore in addition to something to look at this year. So really,
when is the final date for submission?
Tomorrow, I think. Tomorrow.
Okay, good, because I was gonna submit New Verdisia.
Okay, there you go. That's a good one. Go for it. Yeah, the more the merrier. Part of the big fun, of course, is just seeing everybody's designs and having a good time at the end of the year. But we send out some mail out some silver coins to people who win. So
that's going to be awesome. Who are the judges?
Tentatively Pharaoh, and I've asked another one, but haven't gotten a confirmation. So trying to nail down on my judges this year.
Amazing. I need to know who to bribe. That's why.
Yeah, right here.
And lastly, Advent Volker.
I'm currently writing up something that was kind of inspired by Avola Day way back when on a kind of Christian mysticism. I happen to have known an actual magi from Syria who taught me a lot of stuff. So like I specifically know, like, for example, what sign they used to see Jesus on the in the first century, and like a bunch of other signs and wonders that they used to like that they used to like orient themselves, and there's a whole like very very deep lore when it comes to the Magi that's fascinating. I want to so that'll be on luthnight.substack.com when it's done. Been writing it for about a month, but got as you saw in the previous stream we did Lambda, I got sucked into sacred geometry topics because I'm an architect. So technically I have to say architectural designer until I get my license, but yeah, so hopefully that'll come out soon. I also still have a kind of fun video I did on my YouTube channel that was on biomedical security states in the history. I'm hoping to make a video for this Magi thing that I'm making afterwards. I'm slowly getting into the YouTube grind, but not right now because I'm starting a new adventure in Europe soon. So
The hardest part of making YouTube videos is writing the scripts. So you're doing all the legwork and not getting the videos done. So
yeah, I have
just go back and do all your old Substacks.
yeah, scripts are easy for me. It's the video part that takes forever. But anyway, thanks. That's all I gotta say.
Well, thank you very much to all of my guests. I really enjoyed this, and I'm going to finish by rereading the words of the great company of the heavenly hosts that appeared with the angel praising God, and they were saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests."